Robert Hackett, Professor Emeritus at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, about the media and civil courage in media relations. Now, Bob, the last few years in Canada and around much of the world, we've seen a great deal of controversy over media relations, particularly the issue of misinformation and so-called fake news. And at the heart of this, there's a question on the role of the media in politics and in public policy in general, here in Canada and around the world. Are the rules and the scope of journalism shifting nowadays? Where are we headed with the role of the media and of journalists in particular?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Wallenberg-Sugihara Civil Courage Society for inviting me to speak, especially since I think we're going to need a lot of civil courage, the way politics and the world in general are going. And the journalism field, the institutional field of journalism in particular, has fundamentally shifted in the past, say, 25 or 30 years. We have a greater degree of commercialization, and that's reflected in the relative decline of public service broadcasting, a growing entertainment orientation in what used to be news media, contradictory forces of both concentration and monopoly on the one hand, in terms of the ownership of major media organizations, and fragmentation on the other hand, the rise of multiple startups and niche media in the digital environment. And we have the shifting of advertising revenues massively from the so-called legacy press or print media to digital media, with now the emerging internet giants of Facebook and Google effectively acting as gatekeepers for journalism, and the associated decline of resources for newsroom in the traditional so-called legacy news organizations, particularly the local and daily press, which, however, still have an agenda-setting role, although a more diffused one, because they still have influence with policymakers and through online social networks. Their material gets distributed through the online social networks and form the basis of a lot of discussions. We also have the return of partisan media. You know, the historical birth of the press going back a couple of hundred years, were initially, partisan media, reflecting the viewpoint of particular factions or parties. And we see that returning with vengeance since the 1980s with Fox News and so on. And the very architecture of the internet in this century reinforces a division of publics into opinion tribes, into different cognitive worlds, which we see playing out. We no longer seem to even have a shared reality. And finally, a growing cultural skepticism towards expertise in general, towards science, and even the possibility of truth is a real problem for genuine democratic journalism.
Right, thanks. So do you feel that there are stories that journalists in Canada seem to be missing or ignoring? Are there particular areas of inquiry that journalists should be focusing on and are not, in fact?
Yeah, my recent research in the past few years is focused on news coverage of climate and energy politics, thanks in part to the support of the corporate mapping project of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. So most recently, I've been looking at fossil fuel industry's influence on Canada's press, but I think the broader tendency is a general decline in investigative and accountability or watchdog journalism in general. Democratic journalism should be holding the powerful to account, and that's getting rather squatty, that role now, because it takes both resources and independence. And I think that's especially important in a country like Canada, with a powerful gas and oil sector and growing concerns about climate crisis. And that sector, sometimes called the oil patch, has enormous resources to influence and indeed to distort Canadian democracy. One study by the CCPA found, I think, 14 contacts per workday just in British Columbia from the oil and gas sector, fossil fuel industries, if you like, to politicians and government officials. And that's just one province. A researcher named Sean Holman found that reporting in Canadian dailies underplays fossil fuel industry's damage to the environment, society, and economy. It downplays negative news about the industry's economic prospects. that it conducts relatively few interviews with environmentalists or information on the environmental impact of the climate crisis. And in particular, Canada's largest newspaper chain, Post Media, tends to favor fossil fuel development. They're kind of cheerleaders or boosters, and conversely to bash climate action. And in climate news, news that focuses on the climate, it is getting better, most observers I think feel, but they still don't connect the dots between climate change and Canada's gas and oil industry and its production and exports. So that we have this paradox that there are millions of Canadians who want more effective climate action, but somehow think that that is compatible with expanding fossil fuel infrastructure and exports. And then if we can step back a bit more generally, going back 20 years, we published, if you can see this, a book called The Missing News, which was done by Newswatch Canada based at Simon Fraser University. And we identified a broad range of relative blind spots in Canada's news agenda at that time. They included environmental degradation as a systemic and ongoing problem, Canada's involvement in militarism, human rights abuses by Canada's friends, white-collar and corporate crime, the influence of corporate public relations and lobbying on public policy, poverty and class inequality, stories that reflect unfavorably on major advertisers, the perspective of working people and unions, the social and environmental costs of neoliberal policies of austerity and privatization. And more recently, we see, and even the government's concerned about it, the decline of local news. People like news about local issues in government, including conflicts of interest that once would have been reported at the level of local government. So there's a lot there, a lot of work to be done to bring journalism up to the standard it needs. You really need in an informed democracy.
Okay, and pipelines are certainly a very hot issue in Canada and the United States. So I think this begs a question I would like to pose to you is, what accounts for the underreporting of certain kinds of stories? That you've given examples of energy, oil and gas industries, climate change. Why are we not seeing more stories on these kinds of things? I think perhaps you've already led us into that answer.
But it's a huge question and answer. So what I've spent a large part of my 34 years at Simon Fraser University researching is what are these factors and filters that lead to some kinds of news being privileged over others. I think it boils down to power, resources, routines, and ideologies. We have declining resources for original news gathering as the advertising revenue shifts to the entertainment-oriented internet. So that damages complex issue-oriented news and investigative journalism in particular. We have more and more use of generalist reporters, where they have reporters left at all, rather than beats, specialized journalists with expertise and context. So it means that routinely the media start to rely more on press releases and official sources rather than doing their own digging. What else can journalists do if they're expected to file 5 or 6 stories a day? There's serious efforts in Canada's largest newspaper chain that I already mentioned, Post Media, quite conscious efforts to politically homogenize their newspapers, their dailies, and turn them even further and more consistently to the right of the political spectrum, and that includes fossil fuel boosterism. We have the internet's attention economy, a sort of a clickbaited and entertainment imperative to attract audiences with short, visual, entertaining, or outraging items, right? The manufacture of outrage is now a recognized phenomenon. And that trumps, as it were, I use the word advisedly, that kind of news trumps challenging complex news, which upsets or may challenge audiences' own values. And in the energy field in particular, we have, big oil is a secretive and powerful industry. One of the people I interviewed a couple of months ago described it as a cornered animal fighting for its very survival. So it's pulling out all the stops, as it were. It has great resources for lobbying and public relations. It's not shy about intervening with editors, according to the stories I was told. And then, of course, it's got allied governments, in particular in Alberta, which has its so-called energy war room, $30 million to investigate and intimidate environmental groups that are critical of big oil. But I think also, as a byproduct, to rein in critical journalism. And then I don't want to pick on Alberta, but several people I spoke to there trying to do sort of independent journalism describe the political mood or culture as incipiently authoritarian. And that's where, unfortunately, because that's where a lot of Canada's energy news originates, particularly in boardrooms in Calgary. So it's a social ecology that isn't friendly to critical or investigative journalism. And then going even farther, we have step-by-step moves towards the criminalization of nonviolent dissent against fossil fuel infrastructure, which has been declared to be vital to national security. So that opens the door to intensified state repression, not just of those who dissent, but of journalists. We found that journalists were threatened with arrests about a year ago for being present at the militarized RCMP raids on Wet'suwet'en lands. They were trying to defend their territories against a pipeline being built through that. And then the broader context, and we can't go into it very much, but the implicit acceptance, going back to the 1980s, of neoliberalism and petro-extractivism as our dominant economic model, and the link between extractivist industries and economic growth. These are background assumptions, arguably, in the newsroom culture of mainstream mass media. And one of my respondents suggested, Canada, going right back to its foundings, has always had a colonial orientation towards Indigenous peoples in the interests of extracting and exporting so-called natural resources. So all those are factors. One could expand that list, but again, it comes down, I think, to power, resources, routines, and background ideologies.
Okay, and a couple of final questions. You mentioned critical journalism. Are there significant risks or barriers to journalists pursuing these kinds of stories? Personal risks, career risks, or perhaps even more significant risks to journalists who wish to pursue these kinds of stories that you've mentioned?
Yeah, I think we're lucky to live in a country where, at least so far, journalists don't normally have to worry about being imprisoned or assassinated, which happens.
Or worse.
Or worse, yeah. I don't know what's worse, torture, I suppose, disappearing. That has happened in countries, other authoritarian countries. But there still is a certain degree of legal harassment, especially and risk, especially for freelancers who don't have a big organization behind them. Because even the cost of a lawsuit for defamation, even if it's a spurious lawsuit, is prohibitive. It's intimidating. I know for a fact that people have said they haven't pursued stories because of fears of being sued. We don't have effective shield or whistleblower protection laws by and large that would enable journalists to protect their sources from being outed in public if they come out with embarrassing news that then becomes subject to legal proceedings. But I think the bigger risks, frankly, are simply, it's not simply, these are serious risks of professionally stalling your career or even losing your job and being blacklisted, because there's, in the mainstream media, not a lot of alternative employers in Canada. And you also risk sort of being an outcast or socially and professionally ostracized by your colleagues. I think that is a bigger risk, than the sort of blunt physical repression you have in other countries. But it's a very real one.
Right. I can see why certain social media institutions have sprung up to provide independent news and analysis, not from the legacy media, as you call it, but from some more recent social media sites in Canada and elsewhere. Just a final question, if we may. Let's talk about the courage that it takes for journalists in Canada and elsewhere to pursue these kinds of stories, despite the risks. Would you ascribe a certain element of courage? Is a certain amount of courage needed for these folks to pursue these kinds of stories?
I think there is, and it's sometimes physical courage, that if you're reporting an earthquake, with some places really dangerous, like earthquakes or hurricanes or Donald Trump rallies, perhaps. But I think that's not the main concern fortunately for journalists in Canada. I think what it takes here is stamina, the willingness to stand up to management and professional colleagues and receive public opinion, and in some cases a willingness to put your money and energy into building almost from scratch the kind of journalism that we need in democracy, and taking professional and financial risks to create new startups. So I can give you examples of particular people that in my career I've come across that I've actually met from one time or another. If you like, a few examples of people that I admire. One of the Andrew Nikiforuk has written several books on critical of Canada's energy policies and industry, and the need to move beyond a fossil fuel-based economy. And I think he has to fight, as many journalists do, against the temptation of cynicism and despair, because you sometimes wonder, does even very good journalism really make a difference in our political culture and our media system? But I admire journalists who follow Winston Churchill's motto of keep buggering on, you know, even against what seems like very black or dark times. Just hang on, just hang out, you know, just keep buggering on is his phrase. So he'd be one I admire. Going back 20 years, the 1990s, again, going back to the Newswatch research, there was a reporter in Manitoba named Francis Russell, who was looking at the implications of the original free trade agreements between Canada and the United States and then with Mexico, particularly for environmental protection and social programs and so on, other aspects of the flip side of free trade, which almost nobody else in her newsroom or indeed her profession was doing. And she said she sometimes began to question herself. But it took, you know, some courage on her part to keep on going and pursuing those questions. Or George Orr, who is a now retired broadcaster, but he chose to run for the Green Party. He said that, you know, his colleagues or former colleagues are sort of saying, well, that's a strange choice. You know, if he'd run for the BC Liberals, he says that wouldn't have been an issue. But then the people who started, you know, startups like Aaron Miller or Ian Gill at Discourse Media, Dave Beers, who founded the Tyee here in Vancouver.
Right.
Linda Solomon-Wood also put her money into the National Observer, which is now got a national presence. Duncan Kinney, who's started an organization 1 or 2 years ago called Progress Alberta that does investigative reporting based in Edmonton, I believe. Or Kai Nagata, who is a younger former journalist who left a well-paid job as a CTV national reporter in Quebec to pursue research and advocacy work that he found more meaningful. He's working on issues like climate change and more democracy for ordinary citizens. So those are just some of the people I've personally encountered. Let me add one more. It's a sobering story about the real costs of you know, stepping outside the professional bubble, as it were. And that is of Gary Webb, who I heard do a talk in the 1990s. He was the author, the journalist, who did the Dark Alliance series, exposing CIA connections to the cocaine trade to raise funds for the right-wing Contra guerrillas in Nicaragua fighting the socialist government of the day. And he worked for the U.S. daily San Jose Mercury News. And no other media picked up his story until eventually, when they did, it was to contest and challenge his work. And basically, the Los Angeles Times in particular assigned 17 journalists piling on to find flaws in his story, not necessarily undermining the story itself, but nevertheless finding things that might have been overstated or exaggerated in his work, ending his career. And he struggled on as a freelancer for a few years, but tragically committed suicide at the age of 49. So there's somebody whose, unfortunately, courage seems to have failed him. But it indicates, that there are real costs to doing that kind of work. So I do admire people who stick to it for a long period of time.
Right. And I'm certainly familiar with the name Andrew Nikiforuk as far as the Albertan oil and gas industry and the economy there is concerned. Well, I appreciate your contributions, and I've been speaking with Professor Robert Hackett, Professor Emeritus at the Communications Department at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. Thanks for your help with us and for all your information and insight today.
Okay.
Take
Thank
care.
you, Gene, and good luck with the society.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye for now.